All right, so you're thinking about real estate in North Central Virginia and the D.C. metro area, huh? Well, this is the deep dive for you. We're looking specifically at the week ending January 5th, 2025, and using data from Bright MLS. And get this, the year started off a little slower than usual.
Yeah, much slower. We're talking 5-year lows for new listings, contracts, and showings. It seems like everyone needed a little extra time to recover from the holidays before jumping back into the real estate game.
So fewer houses on the market, fewer people looking to buy. Makes sense, right?
You would think so, but here's where things get interesting.
Oh, I love interesting. Lay it on me.
Well, even with the low activity, prices are still going up. Across the entire Mid-Atlantic region, we only saw 3,177 new listings for the week. That's an 11% drop from the same week last year. New contracts also fell to 3,086. That's down 6.3% year over year.
Okay, so fewer listings, fewer contracts.
Fewer showings, too, down 12.6% across the board.
Okay, yeah, definitely a quiet start to the year. But if everything's down like that, wouldn't you expect prices to also be down?
You'd think, right? But the median list price for the week actually hit $405,000.
Ooh.
Yep. That's a 6.6% increase from last year.
So despite fewer homes for sale and fewer buyers, prices are still climbing.
It all comes down to supply and demand. With fewer homes on the market, sellers have the upper hand. There's still enough demand out there to keep prices elevated.
So even though things seem slow, it's still very much a seller's market.
At least for now.
Okay, so that's the overall picture for the Mid-Atlantic. But let's zero in on those areas we talked about at the top, North Central Virginia and the D.C. metro. What's happening there?
Let's start with North Central Virginia. Interestingly, they actually saw a slight uptick in new listings compared to last year.
Oh, really? So that bucks the trend.
It does, but when it comes to new contracts, they followed the overall pattern. They saw an 11.6% decrease, and showings dropped by 14.2%.
So more homes hitting the market, but not as many buyers ready to snap them up. What about the prices in North Central Virginia? Are they up like the rest of the region?
Oh, yeah. The median list price in North Central Virginia is now $599,900.
Wow.
That's a 7.3% increase from last year.
Okay, so sellers are holding firm on those prices, even with fewer buyers actively looking.
Right.
What about the D.C. metro? What are we seeing there?
D.C. Metro actually experienced declines in new contracts and showings too, but unlike North Central Virginia, their new listings are also down 5.9% year over year.
Interesting. So different dynamics are at play in each area. What about their median list price? Is it holding strong like the rest of the region?
Well, this is where things get a little interesting. The median list price in the D.C. Metro actually dipped slightly year over year. It's down 0.2% to $569,000.
A dip. Now that's something I'm sure buyers in the D.C. Metro are happy to hear about.
It might be a sign of things to come, but it's too early to say for sure.
It'll definitely be something to keep an eye on. All right, so we've got a good overall picture of the market, but I love to dig into the details. What are some of the really interesting tidbits you found in the data?
One thing that jumped out at me was the percentage of active listings that have had a price decrease. Across the Mid-Atlantic, it's sitting at 6%, which is actually slightly lower than last year.
So even with the slow start, most sellers aren't feeling the pressure to lower their prices yet.
Not yet. Now, for North Central Virginia, the percentage of price decreases is a little higher at 7.6%. The D.C. Metro is in line with the overall region, holding steady at 6%. But what's really interesting is the number of canceled listings.
Canceled listings. What's going on there?
Well, across the Mid-Atlantic region, canceled listings are up a significant 36% compared to last year.
Whoa, a 36% jump. That does seem significant. What about in North Central Virginia and the D.C. Metro?
Even bigger jumps there. Canceled listings in North Central Virginia are up by a whopping 53.4% year over year, and in the D.C. Metro, they're up 59.1%.
Wow, that is a huge increase. What do you think is driving that trend?
It could be a sign that some sellers are starting to realize the market isn't as hot as it once was.
So rather than lower their prices, they're just pulling their listings altogether.
Yeah, exactly. It's almost like they're in a standoff with the buyers.
A real estate showdown.
Exactly. It'll be interesting to see who blinks first.
Okay, so we've got this interesting dynamic emerging. Buyers are hesitant, some sellers are digging in their heels, and others are pulling out completely. It definitely feels like we're at a bit of a crossroads. But before we dive into what all this means for our listeners, I want to touch on one more data point. Median days on the market. What's the story there?
Well, across the Mid-Atlantic, the median days on market was 54 days. That's an increase of 10 days compared to the same week last year. In North Central Virginia, it's even longer, coming in at 63 days. That's up 11 days year over year.
Okay.
And the DC metro area is a little bit faster, with a median of 56 days on market. Still, that's an increase of 7 days from last year.
So overall, homes are taking longer to sell. Does that surprise you, given all the other trends we've been talking about?
Not really. With buyers being more cautious and some sellers potentially overpricing their homes, it's natural that properties would spend a bit more time on the market.
Okay, so we've laid out the data, but what does it all actually mean for our listener?
Well, that's what we'll be unpacking in the next part of our deep dive.
Stay tuned. We'll be back with part 2, where we'll explore even more insights into the North Central Virginia and Washington, D.C. metro real estate markets, and discuss what all of this data means for you and your real estate journey. Hashtag TTS, the Deep Dive episode, 2025-01-07, part 2 of 3.
Welcome back to our deep dive into those North Central Virginia and D.C. metro real estate markets.
Okay, so let's pick up right where we left off. We talked about that gap between new listings and new contracts. Fewer people are buying, even though in some areas there are actually more houses for sale.
Exactly. Like in North Central Virginia, they had more listings, but way fewer contracts.
So what's going on there? Why aren't buyers jumping on those new listings?
Well, it could be a few things. Maybe the types of homes that are hitting the market just aren't what buyers are looking for right now. You know, the location might not be ideal, or the size, or the style.
So it's not just about the number of houses for sale, it's about having the right kind of houses for sale.
Exactly. And then you also have to think about affordability.
Yeah.
Even with things slowing down a little bit, prices in both North Central Virginia and the DC metro are still really high.
Yeah, that makes sense. High prices are going to keep some people out of the market no matter what.
Exactly. And then on top of that, you have the whole psychological factor. There's a lot of uncertainty in the air right now.
Yeah. When things feel unpredictable, it makes people nervous about making big decisions like buying a house.
Absolutely.
Okay, so we've got a few things potentially contributing to that gap between listings and contracts. But let's get back to those canceled listings for a minute.
Oh, yeah. Those are interesting.
They are. Remember, they're up significantly in both North Central Virginia and the D.C. metro area. What are some of the reasons why a seller might decide to just pull their listing off the market completely?
Well, one reason could be that they're just not being realistic about their home's value. They see that prices have been climbing for a while, so they set a really high asking price, and then...
Crickets.
Exactly. And then they'd rather pull the listing than lower the price.
Interesting. So they're not ready to adapt to the shifting market.
It seems that way. Another reason could be appraisal issues. Sometimes a buyer and seller agree on a price, but then the appraisal comes in lower. That can cause problems with financing and can sometimes even kill the deal.
That makes sense. So it's not always the seller's fault. Sometimes those external factors can really throw a wrench in the works.
Definitely.
Okay, so pricing too high, appraisal issues, and then I imagine the general market uncertainty probably plays a role too, right?
For sure. When sellers see prices dipping or hear about a potential recession, it can make them second-guess their decision to sell in the first place.
It's like everyone's just a little bit spooked right now.
I think that's a good way to put it.
Okay, so we've got these internal market forces like pricing and appraisals, and then we've got these external forces like the overall economy, all kind of swirling around and impacting what's happening in real estate.
And it all ties back to that idea we talked about before about really understanding your local market. What's happening with canceled listings in North Central Virginia might be totally different from what's going on in the DC metro, even though both areas are seeing those increases.
Right, it's all about those hyperlocal nuances.
Right.
Okay, so let's talk about the economy for a second. Interest rates are going up, inflation is still a thing, and everyone's kind of nervous about where things are headed. How are these bigger economic trends impacting the real estate market?
Well, interest rates have a huge impact on affordability. When rates go up, it makes it more expensive to borrow money.
So even if prices stay the same, higher interest rates mean buyers are actually paying more over the life of their loan.
Exactly. And that can really limit how much house someone can afford. And then you add inflation into the mix, and it's a double whammy for buyers.
Because inflation means everything costs more, so they have less money to spend on a house in the first place.
Exactly.
Okay, so buyers are feeling the squeeze. But what about sellers? How are they being impacted by these economic factors?
Well, I think a lot of sellers are watching the news and seeing the same headlines we are. They're worried about a potential recession, and they're wondering if now is really the right time to sell.
So it's kind of like everyone's in a holding pattern, just waiting to see what happens next.
That's a good way to put it.
Okay, so we've got this mix of uncertainty and hesitation coming from both buyers and sellers. It's creating this really interesting dynamic in the market. But we haven't really talked about what all of this means for the future.
Well, that's what we'll be digging into in the final part of our deep dive. Hashtag TTS, the deep dive episode 2025-0107, part 3 of 3.
Okay, so we've laid out all the data. We've got this really interesting snapshot of the market. But what does it all mean for the future? What's going to happen next?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? I mean, obviously no one has a crystal ball, but based on what we're seeing in the data, there are a few potential scenarios that could play out.
Okay, I love a good prediction. Give me those scenarios.
Well, one scenario is that this slowdown we're seeing is just temporary, kind of like a pause before things pick back up again.
So kind of like the market is catching its breath.
Exactly. We might see things start to heat up again in the spring as more buyers enter the market.
Okay, so that's scenario one, the rebound. What's another possibility?
Another scenario is that this slowdown is the start of a bigger shift. Maybe buyer demand keeps softening and we see prices start to adjust.
You mean a market correction, like prices actually going down.
Exactly. And there are a few things that could contribute to that. Those rising interest rates we talked about, continued inflation, maybe even a recession.
So in this scenario, sellers would need to start being more realistic about their pricing, right?
Absolutely. Holding out for top dollar might not be the best strategy anymore.
So flexibility and a willingness to negotiate would be key. Okay, rebound or correction, those are our two main scenarios. But is there anything else that could happen? Anything we haven't even thought of?
Well, there's always the wild card factor. Some big event that no one saw coming and completely changes the game.
Oh yeah, like what?
Who knows? Maybe some major global event or a sudden shift in government policy. You just never know.
Okay, so the future is uncertain. That's definitely clear. But let's bring it back to our listener for a second. What does all of this mean for someone who's actually thinking about buying or selling a house in North Central Virginia or the DC Metro right now?
Well, as we've said all along, it really depends on their individual goals and their situation. Are they a buyer, a seller, or just kind of dipping their toes in the water?
Right. There's no one-size-fits-all answer. So let's break it down. Let's say our listener is thinking about buying a house. What are some of the key takeaways from this deep dive that would be helpful for them?
I think the biggest thing for buyers right now is to be patient. Don't feel pressured to jump into anything. Take your time to really analyze the market, figure out what you can afford, and don't be afraid to walk away if something doesn't feel right.
So no need to panic, even if it seems like everyone else is buying.
Exactly. This might actually be a good time for buyers who are willing to be patient and strategic.
Okay, that's great advice for buyers. But what about sellers? What should they be thinking about in this market?
For sellers, I think the key is to be realistic. Those days of multiple offers over asking price might be over. You need to price your home competitively from the start, make sure it shows well, and be prepared to negotiate with buyers.
Okay, so no more playing hardball.
Right. Buyers have more options now, so you need to work a little harder to stand out.
So whether you're a buyer or a seller, it sounds like doing your research and understanding the market is more important than ever.
I would agree with that.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive. We talked about all those crazy cancel listings. We explored the possibility of a market correction. And we even touched on those bigger economic forces that are shaping the real estate landscape.
Yeah, it's been a fascinating conversation.
It has, and hopefully it's been helpful for our listeners. So to everyone out there who's thinking about buying or selling a house in North Central Virginia or the DC metro area, remember, knowledge is power.
Stay informed, stay curious, and don't be afraid to ask questions.
And who knows, maybe we'll see you out there at an open house.
Until next time.